to piggyback on what I did and build on that and talk about the religious roots of the 12-step approach. What was really funny is that yesterday at the panel, we spent a long time saying, someone spent a long time saying AA as each group is different, and yet they seem to have certain precepts that you need to subscribe to, and many claim AA is the only way, and isn't that unusual? And I'm thinking, not really. If you look at their roots, it's not unusual at all. It's perfectly explainable. So maybe when you focus on this, maybe you'll see why I think it's like, oh, that's a no-brainer. It's obvious why it's like that. And I'm not saying, this is nothing against AA. Well, I teach, our students are, most of them in some kind of 12 steps, so we're very positive about it. But there's nothing wrong with taking, an evaluative approach of something, and I think it's very interesting to learn the historical roots of a group. It explains a lot. So this is just my website for talks like this. If you're interested, I have some papers on there and things you can, some descriptions of what I do and some of the intellectual backgrounds of it. But that's not what I'm going to do today. Today I'm doing the religious roots of the 12-step approach. And I do mean religion in particular because it has a very clear-cut religious background. And some people feel that the 12 steps, the steps themselves, Bill Wilson received by inspiration. I mean, it's really interesting the way there's kind of a religiousness about the 12 steps. It's really interesting. And it might seem strange until you examine their history, and then you say, oh, I see, I understand now where that was coming from. So I thought we'd do that today. I actually wanted to start with Brother Biddle here. Just because you might think, well, you're all in therapy, I'm in a seminary, we're very different. Well, no, actually, our training program is very similar to your training program, and our students are probably very similar to your students, for those of you who have students, or those of you who were students, because we just want to make everything relevant. They say, how does this relate to real life? So I just thought we'd see an example from my world, okay? So you can see that here, Brother Biddle's the minister, and that's his assistant. All right. Happy Warbler, our music minister. My sermon series on compulsive behaviors. Any hymn ideas? How about Breathe on Me for the alcohol sermon? Ever hear that? Breathe on me, breath of God. Yeah, that'll work, but I'm also preaching on overeating and compulsive shopping. Easy. There's a wideness in God's mercy. And a charge to God, a charge to keep I have. Okay. But perhaps you're not ready for my political concern series. Try me. Global warming, heavenly sunlight. Defense spending, leaning on the everlasting arms. Japan bashing, in Christ there is no east or west. Darn, he's good. For just such moments as these did we drill for hours in seminary. So ministers want to be relevant, just like therapists, and we want to, be in touch with people's issues. So here's what we're going to talk about. What do psychology and religion have in common? How can it be helpful to understand something about theology? That's my field, theology. What are the theological and religious roots of AA? And what makes AA different? And you probably do know some of the roots, but I'm hopefully give you more detail than you've had before. That's my goal for today. I've got a lot of things to hold on to here. Are they? Which one? They just gave me this one. Well, it's up here. Yeah, this is just, they don't have, I didn't have a clip. It is being recorded. Okay. Great. Couldn't find a clip. Okay. All right. Okay, well, I won't belabor the point, but the fields of religion and psychology often ignore each other. I mean, not to be too self-promoting, I think we pay more attention to you than you do to us, because we really teach a lot of psychology in the seminary. No offense, but I haven't seen a lot of religion being taught in therapy training programs, but I could be completely wrong because I didn't take one. Although we do have a degree in counseling at our school. Okay. But we have a lot more in common than you might think. Okay, so let's see what they are. We're both preoccupied with subjective and internal realities. Stop me if you don't agree, but if you agree, just hang on. We depend on the testimony of individuals. We test results in human experience. And we have a great effect on our culture. That's for sure for both fields. Okay, there's more. And meaning is the key to both fields, I think. More important than undergirding everything, we both have to do with meaning. We both try to understand the human dilemma. That's especially important for me in the field of theology. We both try to make sense out of our very complex existence. So, Dr. Stanton Jones, who's a clinical, we both work to foster human understanding. Here's what Dr. Stanton Jones says in I think it's the Journal of the American Psychological, no, it's a text from the American Psychological Association. He says both psychology and religion need to understand each other better, which is my little personal mission today. He says that we need a willingness to establish such a dialogical relationship with religion will necessarily presume the willingness of scientists and professionals to become theologically and philosophically literate, and for theologians and philosophers to become scientifically and professionally literate. So even though I teach in the field of theology, and you may say, I don't really need to know that, because I know theology, when I look at the 12 steps and when I look at AA, I see some things jump out at me that may not jump out for people that don't have that training, and I wanted to share that with you because it's extremely interesting. It helps explain a lot of things about AA and why it works and how it functions. Okay, I went to Hazelden when I was writing my book on victims and sinners. I went into the bookstore, the gift shop. You think a treatment center has a gift shop, but it does. It was a nice place. Have you ever been to Hazelden? They have their own cross-country ski trails. I almost wanted to, go there. Like, could you do an intervention on me? It was like so nice. Really, they had a swimming pool too. They said they didn't let the patients use it because they were afraid, I don't know, maybe they weren't well enough, but they could go cross-country skiing. They had the skis and everything. I thought, okay, I could go to this place. But anyway, I picked up this card in the gift store. This is on the outside of the card. Relax, God is in charge. I picked it up in the bookstore, in the gift store of Hazelden up in Minnesota. You know about Minnesota, the land of 10,000 treatment centers? Have you heard that? Okay, so anyway, what's going on? How come I can go into a secular treatment center to do research, go into the bookstore and pick up a card like that? That seems really religious to me. Isn't that odd? Have you had that experience? Well, I didn't understand it. This was at the beginning of my research. So I wanted to refresh your memory about the 12 steps. I'm sure you all know them. But what I want you to do is, as I talk about the religious roots of AA, I want you to compare what I'm going to tell you about the group that preceded AA, compare that to anything you may know about the way 12-step groups function, or the 12-step groups themselves, the 12 steps themselves, okay? So you all know this, I'm sure, right? You all have it memorized probably. Okay. All right. So again, how did a secular place like Hazelden end up with a card like that for sale in a bookstore? Where does addiction recovery, the grandmother of it all, AA, stand in relationship to this? Well, actually, AA has a genius. The genius of AA is it stands at the juncture between the two fields of psychology and spirituality, or psychology and religion. Without realizing it or consciously trying to do that, AA has taken explicitly religious and theological principles and made them effective to a wide audience, one often unreached by organized or formal religion. So we'll see now how AA came to do that. And again, your job is, remember that, everything you know about the 12-step groups and meetings, and if you hear something that I'm saying that relates to it, just make a mention of it. Raise your hand or shout it or whatever, okay? Okay, I want to talk about the origins of the Oxford group. Is everyone familiar? Have you ever heard of the Oxford group? And you know that the Oxford group was the predecessor of, that Bill Wilson, Abby T, and all these people belong to the Oxford group. Okay, basic AA history. But you may not know about the history of that group itself. Okay, Most people just know just a little bit about the group. So I want to tell you more about the group so you can really get a close look at the similarities and differences. Okay, the Oxford group was very evangelistic. That means they were trying to preach the gospel. All right, I'm skipping some things because I want to leave more time for discussion, like we didn't have enough last time. So if you were at the keynote, so if you want to bring things up from the keynote and from this, we'll have a lot more time, I hope, this time. Okay, we start with the Oxford group because, as I said, the founder of AA, Dr. Bob Smith, and Bill Wilson had very formative experiences with this group. They were members, and they adopted or adapted many of its principles. Okay, the Oxford group is not to be confused, first of all, with the Oxford movement in England. I don't know if there's any Episcopalians here, but that was a very profound movement in England. This is different. They used the word Oxford. I think they used it kind of for PR purposes. It sounded good, you know, because Oxford makes you sound high-toned, as we used to say, but, or as they say in the South. But they really were never at Oxford. They may have visited it, but it's not the Oxford movement. But anyway, that's what its name was. It had other names, too. It was American, U.S. It was evangelistic, non-denominational, non-church, what we call parachurch, meaning parallel to the church. It's not against the church, but it's not in the church, parallel to the church. Founded around 1908 by the Reverend Frank Buckman. Is anyone familiar with him? Okay. It was also known as the First Century Christian Fellowship. But it achieved and there's some of its other names, Oxford Group, Buckmanism, later called Moral Rearmament, which is very interesting, how it changed around World War II. I'll go into that briefly, just because it's so interesting. Okay, not that it relates to AA so much. Okay, so these are some of its names. Who was Frank Buckman? He was a conservative Lutheran pastor. He had a pietistic background. Now, pietism is a type of Christianity, or it's a word used within Christianity, meaning the more experiential, affective, emotional states are really encouraged. So he had that kind of background. From Lutheranism, of course, he'd get doctrine. But from pietism, he'd get the emotional, experiential, where maybe it even was heightened to the extent that the doctrine didn't matter anymore, but the experience mattered more. Okay, he had a charismatic personality. He wasn't a charismatic in the sense of charismatic Christian, but he was like, people were drawn to him. He was a lecturer in evangelism at Hartford Seminary. He wasn't on full-time faculty and didn't have tenure, but, you know, he was like an adjunct, just for the academics in the room. Okay. His main concern was Christian conversion. He was very evangelistic. He wanted to convert people. His main focus group was the up and outers. This is very interesting. He focused on not the down and outers, but the up and outers. Not the poor people, but the rich people. That's who he wanted to convert. Isn't that interesting? It's almost like this Christian group, I think, that works with young kids, Young Life. It goes after it works in high schools, and it goes after the popular kids, because it figures if the popular kids join, all the rest of the kids will fall in line. And I think that was Frank Buckman's idea. If the influential, wealthy persons are positive towards us, everyone else will think it's a good thing. That was his philosophy anyway. Okay, through gathering students around him and then others, first he started with students, he began a movement which focused on changed lives. That was his important focus, change lives. And he focused on the elites, people with money, influence, and prestige. Okay, so he and his chosen leaders, and was all young men, okay, that's the way he was. His chosen leaders swept through cities in America and sometimes overseas, organizing what they called house parties. Was anyone familiar with this concept that they had? House parties where some rich person would offer their home, or they might rent a hotel or a ballroom, and they'd have it in beautiful settings. They'd have it here, okay? They wanted to have a nice place, not some little rundown church in the inner city. They wanted to go to the good places, the fancy places. Lavish settings. They were really focused on that. That was very important to them. It was kind of a PR principle for them. But they also had a spirit of intimacy, care, and informality. So even though they'd be in a beautiful hotel like this or somebody's mansion in Long Island, they would still be very intentional to have a one-on-one relationship, look you in the face, get to know your name, be buddy-buddy with you, put their arm around you, very intimate, very friendly, very caring approach. And this was genuine. I'm not saying they were just manipulating people. They got to know people really well. These house parties were lavish, day-long or even weekend events. People would stay, for several days. And they would be informally but persistently brought through a process of spiritual conversion. By fostering the spirit of intimacy with each guest, they enable potential converts to confess their most troubling personal sins. They got to know you really well, and pretty soon and they would, of course, elicit this, you'd be confessing your deepest, darkest secrets. This became the secret of their early success. Although they worked hard to use modern terms to explain this essentially evangelistic conversion process, for them, the idea of sin was paramount, and the word was used. So they used sin. That they wanted to know your worst sins and get you to confess them. Not like to the whole group, it was one-on-one, but still. They really didn't believe in theological discussion. They wouldn't argue with you. If you brought up theology, they'd say, no, we don't do that. Well, that's not what we do here. We want to know about you. We want to know about your problems and so forth. They had simple slogans and maxims. Remember, if anything rings a bell, they said, study men, not books. So and there's groups today, if you try to argue with them theologically, they go, no, we don't talk theology here. Do you know Jesus or whatever? Okay, whatever their main thing is. Buckman was really no intellectual, and he distrusted theological arguments since he saw it as a way to avoid conviction. Conviction meaning awareness of your own sin. So his hand-picked leaders refused to discuss theology with a prospect. Instead, like I said, they relied on slogans and maxims. This anti-intellectual approach did not meet with much opposition, even though their chosen converts were often educated, influential, or wealthy. And oftentimes, if you're influential and or wealthy, you also had a pretty decent education. People didn't complain about this. They probably were unused to the approach of having someone care about them rather than argue with them. But then, on the other hand, much American religion has an anti-intellectual quality to it, so Buckman really fit in with the tenor of the times, and that's the same today. This attitude has characterized American Christianity from its early years, or actually an anti-intellectual bent. But it also appealed, his approach, because times were growing troubled in America, especially as the 1930s approached, and you know about that from your history. People were looking for simple formulas. They were looking for ways to return to a simpler age and ways to maintain, for better or worse, their status quo in the face of increasing economic and political challenges. Remember, he's dealing with people that are people of means who are looking at society changing and getting worse and probably thinking about, can I sustain this? 1929, stock market crash, right? All that, he's working during all this period of time, okay? So theological simplicity was its hallmark. The group had only a few central contentions. They really tried to minimize their central claims, okay? If you're interested in further exploring this, see Walter Houston Clark, The Oxford Group, Its History and Significance. That was one of the good books I turned up. Now, some of this, if you are interested in this, you can find some of this in my book, Victims and Sinners, Spiritual Roots of Addiction and Recovery. I have at least 2 chapters on the history of the Oxford Group and the backgrounds of AA, so this would be another place to get that. Okay, here's some of their main contentions. Again, I'm not hearing any, similarities yet or differences, but, all right, all people are sinners. People can be changed. Confession of sin is the absolute first step. The age of miracles has returned. That was a surprise to a lot of people. Once you are changed, you must change others. To keep it going. Keep your own thing going. Do you want to, did everyone get that? Okay, those principles, those were key. Okay, what about their definition of sin? Well, of course, sin today is a dirty word. People don't like to use it. Even in seminary, people sometimes don't like to use it. But they had no problem with it. And in fact, the culture at the time had no problem with the word. So it wasn't a challenge for anyone that they used the word. But the way they defined it was very, not different, not idiosyncratic, but nice and simple. And that was important. So sin was anything that stands between you and God. Self-focus. That was sin. Self-focus. Self-will. What? Exactly. Trying to control your own life. Personal shortcomings. Okay? Pride. This is how they define sin. Not too different from the Christianity of their day. I could critique this up one side and down the other. I don't agree with this, and I'm a theologian and I teach about sin. So that's a whole nother story, and I wish I could go into it. But this is how they defined it, and it's very interesting compared to where AA ended up. Okay? So I hope you're thinking about that. And of course, remember, they're preaching to people that self-will, pride, they had all that, right? That's how they got successful in the first place. CEOs and so forth. What about the principles of behavior? They didn't just focus on beliefs. Remember, I said they were fairly low-key theologically. They had very little theology, but they were very intent on changing your behavior. Remember, it said all people can be changed. Change people have to change others. Changing behavior was number one for them. Okay, so what were some of the principles? What were they expecting? What would you look like once you had a conversion? And again, they were one-on-one. They were working slowly. A person would be assigned to you to bring you along. And they wouldn't just bring you along during the house party. They'd make sure you had a group to go to. I should have said this. They had small groups. After you left the house party, if you were converted, you would be assigned to a small group in your neighborhood or in your area, wherever. Not rigidly, which one you wanted to go to, but you would get a mentor. The person would be sure that you were on track, and here's how they could tell whether you were. This is what they expected of you. 4 absolutes. Absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. What would we call this in terms today? If we had, what would it be? Some kind of dysfunctional thing? What? Unrealistic or perfectionism, right? Or what? All or nothing, yeah. Okay, so that's what they expected to see in the person. And so, of course, in these small groups, they would be critiquing each other. You're supposed to critique yourself and critique your other friends in the group. And they would also do something, I don't think I have it in a slide, but they would listen for God. This is doesn't relate, but they would all have a blank pad. At the beginning of every day, they would sit there waiting to receive some kind of divine message for their day or for bigger issues, and they would write it down and they would share that. It's almost like Quakerism in that aspect. That was different. But that's how they could tell whether you're on track or not. And you had a group that you were accountable to. But how could you do this? It's almost impossible. We said it was, unrealistic, right? So how could you do that? Okay, here's how you did it. Here's how you achieve those high goals. Sharing. You had to confess your sins to your fellows and witness to other people. That was really, really important. Surrender. You had to completely surrender your will to Christ. Restitution. Not hearing anything. Restitution, making up to people that hurt you. Guidance, daily listening for God's will in every detail of life. That's how you attain the 4 absolutes. Okay, so was this an aberration or was this something pretty mainstream? What did he borrow from American Christianity? He from Pietism, which remember I said he was involved in Pietism, he got a focus on personal sin, and not every Christian group focuses on personal sin, This is not, we may think that because of evangelicalism today, but really that's not been the history of Christianity. There's been different ways that sin has been seen, and whether it's personal or global, or a disorder or demons, or it's changed. Okay, focus on personal sin, giving up to God. This is all from Pietism. A demand for dramatic change and ethical perfectionism from Pietism. From Revivalism, which Buckman had participated in, he got a demand for conversion and personal evangelism. In other words, they got in your face about conversion. They weren't just like gradually waiting for you to come up with it yourself. You know, they, in a sense, did an intervention on you. I mean, a house party was like that. They really were in your face until you confessed. And if you didn't, you know, you obviously were, you know, not being honest, and they would push you on that. And personal evangelism, one-on-one evangelism, very, very important to them. Theological keys, they didn't have many, but these are the ones they did have. Personal sin is the root of all problems. Now, this is very important. Think about that. If you were my theology students, I'd ask you that. Is personal sin the root of all problems? And half of you would say, oh, yes, absolutely. But some of the other ones would say, tsunami, I don't know, like ecological destruction maybe, but did I cause that personally? I don't know. So, you know, I get them thinking about evil and bigger problems. But they felt everything was about personal sin. Once converted, a person acts rightly. We could have a whole political discussion about that, but I won't go there. Okay, other factors. This is something else, there's a little more idiosyncratic to the group. They had a sense of external opposition. They really felt that they were kind of persecuted by the church. But what really they were doing was they were rejecting the organized church and being very critical of it and saying it was dead and it wasn't, you know, honest enough and it wasn't alive and the worship was dead and they were really spiritual, but the church wasn't very spiritual. But they also, you know, sometimes you can project that hostility, so they kind of said, but they really hate us, and so we need to separate ourselves out, and so forth. They had a sense of divine mission, big time. They were going to convert the entire of North America, probably, and Europe too. They had big goals. Barely concealed contempt for conventional religion. That was very important to them. This was not hidden at all. They had no social agenda. This is important too. They had no opinion about social systems or government. This came back to bite them later on. And they had problems reduced to personal sin, all problems, okay? So nobody's saying anything, but hopefully your minds are working and your wheels are turning.
It sounded like a cult.
Well, I guess some people would have said yes, and other people would have said, well, it's a parachurch group, and you know, they kind of rouse people up and they do their job and then they send them on to the church, and that's okay, and we don't mind, you know. So it may have had some cultic characteristics, but I think by the strict definition of cult, it wasn't really a cult. But you know, in religion, we have sects and cults. I mean, we have all that, you know, clearly defined, and I'd say they don't meet the criteria. But there were cultic aspects, and it depended on an individual how drawn they were and how loyal they were to that, and exclusive of other things.
You said they were reading in their face. Would you say that meant there was a lot of kind of pressure?
There was a lot of pressure on individuals to convert. Yeah, a lot of pressure, but it was kindly pressure.
To convert to...
To convert to Christ, have a conversion
But not
to
to a
Christ.
particular
No, they didn't care. But they would like you to stay part of the Oxford group, though.
And the ultimate mission statement or purpose of the group?
They didn't really write these things down. They weren't like that. They just wanted to, you know, like traditional Christian evangelism, to have people convert to be Christian, you know, to be with Christ, to accept Christ as their personal Savior. They wouldn't have put it that way because that's more modern, but that's would translate.
But they have no real rituals per se.
No, that's a good point. They had kind of ritualistic things, but mostly the meetings were like a ritual. But they weren't structured like first we have confession of sin, then we worship, and then we read out of this book. I mean, they had Bible readings. They had time where they listened and wrote on their pad, but I mean, each individual group could probably organize that the way they wanted to, depending on the members.
They did have one mission, which was to compete with communism, so they were much
Later.
more interested in living over.
Later, yeah.
I think that you're saying just at the beginning.
Yeah, when they became moral rearmament. Yeah, then they had a strong political agenda. That was later. But and I really don't spend a lot of time with that because AA has already split off by then from them. So AA is more coming out of the original, earlier Oxford group, and although they're very interesting as a group, it's not so much related to AA later.
So they didn't have any one alliance, any one like
Denomination?
I mean, like
They weren't connected to any denomination, even though Buckman was a Lutheran. No. Buckman was funded by the Lutherans for a while because he was young. He was like, they let him be a missionary to the groups like the YMCA, and they gave him a house to work in the inner city and stuff, but and work on college campuses, but he didn't, I don't think he continued to be funded by the Lutherans. He may have kept his ordination. I don't think they ever defrocked him, but he didn't personally identify himself so much with that denomination after a while.
So it sounds like they were really putting, I mean, and this way it sounds to me, that they're putting the responsibility on the individual, like not, like that individual not having any external power, some external power that they worship to, but rather putting the responsibility on themselves and their own kind of higher power.
Yeah, their relationship with God, right. Yeah, that was key, right. But they were also accountable to their group. That was very important. This group was extremely successful for a while. Everybody knew it. In the 20s, 30s, everyone knew about this group. Here's the 12 steps again. All right, now that was just early Oxford group, sorry. Now I want to talk a little bit about AA, and I'm just bringing this up again to clue you in to see whether you found anything. I may have a few more things to say about the Oxford group, but I just wanted to say, do you see anything now that we've gone through that connects to this from early Oxford group? Everything. Confession, yeah. Where is it on there? How about control, self-will, pride? They may not use the same words. Personal shortcomings. Yeah, evangelism. Do you see that? Not that they wouldn't use the word. If you're changed, you have to change others.
And even the four absolutes are all in there.
They are?
Inventory and the unselfishness and the love and stuff.
Okay, well, I'll go on in a few minutes to say what was similar and what the AA did differently, because they obviously didn't, or they would have stayed in that group if they wanted to be exactly the same. Well, because the Oxford group leaders were so anti-theological and vague in their beliefs, the group gave people very little theological substance to go on, but oftentimes they revitalized what people already brought with them, and many people did bring religious backgrounds, and they had been alienated from them, and when they got to the Oxford group, it revitalized their faith, which was a good thing, and people passed through these groups, sometimes staying, maybe not even a year, but those who benefited the most often went on to live lives of productivity and service, and so all in all, I'd say the Oxford group had a fairly positive impact on society and produced a whole generation of leaders in different fields, including church fields, but other social service fields too. So I'm really not putting them down. It's just a very interesting little phase of history there. Okay, now what about AA? I don't think I need to go into the history of AA too extensively. I think most people are aware of that. Is that true, would you say? Okay. And there's a lot of hagiography. You know what that means. That's like saint worship. That's what we say in history of religion. So there's all that, and I don't want to go through that. But I do want to look at some of the theological similarities and process similarities and differences between AA and the Oxford group. And that's what my book is pretty much all about. I look at the big book in great detail and compare it to, I do a theological analysis, or what they call in biblical studies exegesis, which is that you're drawing the meaning out. I pretty much exegete the big book and show it's how the underlying theological principles it got from the Oxford group, how some were there and some they subverted or changed. Okay, well, writers studying AA often make much of the influence of William James and Carl Jung on founder Bill Wilson and the early group, and it's true that these are influences, and they gave the early members a freer attitude towards religious experience, but I don't think that those writers are very influential, not even close to what influence came from the Oxford group. I think those two things are minimal at best compared to this. This is solid. I mean, this is very, very profoundly influential on AA. I think people bring up James and Jung to say, well, see, they have a spiritual tradition that they're kind of attaching to, and it's non-denominational, it's not, it's kind of open and it's good and all that. Well, I actually think the background of AA is a lot more clear-cut type of Christianity. And I'm saying all of this for several reasons. One, not because I'm trying to cut down AA. Plenty of our students have recovered, if not all, through some kind of 12-step, so I'm not against it. And secondly, I'm never saying that AA is a Christian group. Some of my students would like to say that, but I would never say that because I don't believe that, and I don't even think it should be in any way Christian or anything else. I think AA can be AA, and that's fine with me. So I'm not saying this for that. I'm just saying that for me, who teaches seminarians, who teaches in a church setting, and I teach people who have come back to religion from having been in AA, I notice a profound effect on their theology when they finally get back into having clear beliefs. And some of them go out into the ministry. And the reason I ended up looking at this so deeply is because the effect that it has on them and the way they go and then preach in the church, I'm not completely comfortable with. And it's not about addiction, it's about sin. I'm not happy with what it does to their understandings of what's wrong with people. I think it actually hurts in some ways how they then preach the gospel to their congregations when they go into the ministry. And when they become chemical dependency counselors, that's not my, that's not my critique. I think they do a fine job there. But it's interesting when they try to mix the religion and the 12 steps that I find it really sometimes coming out a little bit funny. And that was why I ended up getting into this project. Okay, but let's go back to AA because it's really interesting. They didn't keep everything. Remember, Bill Wilson said, I just want to focus on alcoholics. They're my personal mission. And the Oxford group said, no, I'm sorry, that's too narrow. You got to look, it's great that you want to help them. We want to help them too. That's wonderful. But we want you to have a broader mission. They liked him. He was real popular, really successful in AA. In the Oxford group, he was fine. But he had his focus, and they just didn't agree with that, and they parted ways. You know that, right? Okay, so here's Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, and I don't know if EBT really was that involved anymore, but here they are, fresh from their Oxford group conversion experience, and they're founding this new group to fit alcoholics, and they really want to adapt what they just came from. So what did they do? Well, they couldn't take it all. Some of it just didn't work for them, for the alcoholics. The first thing they did was they threw over perfectionism, the 4 absolutes. They said, no way, alcoholics cannot live with this. That's way too perfectionistic. It's just going to make them discouraged, and it's not going to work. So they threw that out. He said it made the alcoholics nervous, angry, or hopeless. What else did he throw out? Publicity. The Oxford group was very publicity oriented. They wanted to be in the paper. Anonymity was the opposite of them. Anonymity is not us. They wanted to be famous. They wanted everyone to know who they were. They wanted to know, guess who just got converted by the Oxford group, the CEO of, whatever company was big then, some train probably, the Reading Railroad just became an Oxford group member. Okay. So Bill Wilson said that's not good for alcoholics. That's just what they do not need. So he immediately rejected that too, which is a lot of where the anonymity came from. I think it's a reaction to the Oxford group's stress on publicity. Any hint of theology, they gave that up fairly quickly. Although there was like battles, and I'm not Ernie Kurtz, I'm not like, head historian of, head knowledge of AA history, but I know that there was some splits between the New York and the Ohio and all that, and some wanted to keep more God language and some wanted less, but eventually the less people won, I think. They rejected explicit hostility to organized religion, at least overtly they rejected it because it wasn't good for business. And they wanted very much to have Catholics be able to join, and so obviously the Catholics were suspicious of them, and they had to be a little bit more friendly to religion if they wanted to help people who had a religious background. What did AA adapt, though? Why don't you tell me before I click on these slides? What do you think they adapted? Okay. Anything else? Okay. Any confession, evangelism? Self-will?
Surrender.
Okay. Anything else? Restitution. Right. Now, I don't have all those up there, but I agree with what you're saying. Let's see if I agree with you on what you did say. Admitting one's sins becomes admitting one's bondage to alcohol. Personal sins become character defects. Sin as the core problem becomes the disease of alcoholism. And I know they didn't use disease back there. They said malady or, whatever word, but I probably shouldn't have used the word disease on there, but nevertheless, the core problem is your alcoholism, your drinking, your over drinking. your drinking in general. Powerlessness over sin, powerless over alcohol. Pride, as you said, self-will run riot. Real similar. And I have a lot of problem with that actually as a core definition of sin, but that's another theological story that we don't have time to go into. Process similarities. I think you've already picked up on that, right? Conviction, he said. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. First of all, we had to quit playing God. The alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. So the process of conviction, working with somebody to get them to admit that they are alcoholic. And somebody came up to me and said, he said, I made a faux pas too. I don't know if he's here. He said, I made a faux pas when I first joined AA, and I said, hi, I'm, whoever, and I'm a recovered alcoholic. And it was like, no, you can't say that. You have to say you're recovering. So, they had principles you had to stick with, and conviction. You had to be convicted of the fact that your permanent state, your permanent identity, or your core identity is as an alcoholic. And really for the Oxford group, your core identity was as a sinner. Now they believed in miracles and that you would be saved and you could be changed, but nevertheless, since these things would keep coming up, you had to always revert to that identity. And then the alcoholic is self-centered in the extreme. Thus we use the nutcracker of the obsession plus the allergy as a tool of such power it can shatter his ego. That's what the Oxford group did too. That was their exact goal, was to shatter the ego and get the person to admit what their problems were. Conversion. Conviction. Remember, the Oxford group, they convicted you. They worked with you one-on-one. Brought you to a conviction, which should lead to your conversion, right? Because conviction and conversion were two separate things. Conviction, yeah, I'm a horrible, wretched, worm of a person, is not the same as now I turn my will over to God. That's really two different steps. So they had the conviction, but then they wanted to move you to conversion. Wilson did that. Wilson believed that a spiritual awakening will happen through this ego collapse. In fact, this is the only way it can happen. Writing to Carl Jung, Wilson said, most conversion experiences do have a common denominator of ego collapse at depth. And change. The steps require a leveling of pride. You've heard about people saying, yeah, sure, maybe she stopped drinking, but she's a dry drunk, right? So that's not enough. Just stopping the drinking it's good, but they expect more of you, just like in the Oxford group. And then the method, small group intimacy, right? Small meetings. Focus on one's personal problems. Primary loyalty to the group. Your home meeting and all that. Focus on individual rather than social system. And the person-to-person approach. Now, I think I might have skipped this very, very interesting quote. I don't know if I can find it now, because Frank Buchman, when World War II, before World War II started, but when Hitler was on the rise, here it is. He did think for a very long time, until maybe they evolved into moral rearmament, which was after AA, he did think that personal sin was the root of all problems. And if anyone became converted, they would be fine. They would be an asset to society. Everything would be okay. You could trust what they did. They were now under the will of God and being controlled by God. So Buchman went to Germany one time. And he went to Europe, actually. And here is a quote that was reported in a reputable New York newspaper that Frank Buchman said when he came back from a trip to Europe right on the eve of World War II. And remember, his thinking is, sin is the root of all problems. Personal sin is the core of everything. He said, quote, I thank heaven for a man like Adolf Hitler, who built a front line of defense against the Antichrist of communism. Think what it would mean to the world if Hitler surrendered to the control of God, or Mussolini, or any dictator. Through such a man, God could control a nation overnight and solve every last bewildering problem. Isn't that interesting? Talk about personal sin being the root of all problem, and conversion meaning now you're okay and a real asset to the world. I find that very striking. This was reported by Niebuhr in his book, Christianity and Power Politics. Niebuhr did not like Frank Buckman. Niebuhr is a very, very famous American theologian. Okay, so how about key differences? And I said some, but there are more. The Oxford group preached a reliance on Jesus Christ. Obviously, the AA didn't and never did do that. But that was very big for the Oxford group. So for whatever reason, and you'd have to look more in depth at Wilson's thinking, he wanted to throw that out. I don't know how he felt personally about it, but I guess he didn't think that would be good for the group because it would be exclusivist. AA now limits the divine element to higher power. I could give theological critiques to these and theological, we could have a conversation, but I don't feel that's my job today. But in my book, I do that.
Was that a decision to use higher power a theologically based decision or psychological?
I think it was PR. And not in a bad sense, in a good sense. Like we want it to be open to other people. We want it to be useful for other religions, and then people that are having problems with the God language, this will avoid that too. The Oxford group expected the miracle of dramatic sudden change. They definitely don't expect that. If you fall off the wagon, if you have a problem, there's a lot of acceptance to coming back and getting in the group. And the Oxford group really judged you if you slipped up. They'd put you back, they'd get you back in, but they really judged you. AA says one day at a time. The Oxford group was like sudden dramatic change. The Oxford group pietism had assurance of salvation, whereas in AA you're only one day away from a drunk, and one drink away from a drunk, and you're always recovering. You're never, you can never say I don't have this problem anymore. You're just going to keep it at bay. And then like I said, AA warns only one drink away from a drunk. Key similarities. Pride or self-will run riot is the key problem. They both agreed on that. Trying to be in control, thinking you are in control, prevents you from getting help. Surrendering to God or the higher power is the way to change. And again, as a theologian, I could go on and on about these are not always this is not the only way to go. This is not the only way, even from a Christian perspective, to be religious or to be Christian. But again, Bill Wilson did stay true to some of the really core principles of the Oxford group. Okay, now I just want to say, even after all this, you might be thinking, why don't you just stay with theology and don't mess in our addiction recovery stuff. So, but I can't do that because it's all over the place. It's very common that churches say they have recovery groups, they're recovery churches. It's maybe not 100%, but even 10% of churches that feel this is very important is something I have to concern myself with since I'm preparing ministers. And this cartoon might seem silly, but it's a little more common than you think. So let's, I'll just kind of end with that, okay? At least we'll wind down at this point. Okay, so Doonesbury, this minister is prides himself to be radical and relevant and all that. Okay, so he says, here's some people, they're church shopping, really common today, okay? So, what would you like to know about the little Church of Walden, folks? Don't hold back. I know how difficult it can be to choose a church. Well, what's your basic approach here, Reverend? Is it traditional gospel? Well, in a way, I like to describe it as 12-step Christianity. Basically, I believe that we're all recovering sinners. My ministry is about overcoming denial. It's about recommitment, about redemption. It's all in the brochure there. Wait a minute, sinners, redemption, doesn't that all imply guilt? Well, yes, I do rely on the occasional disincentive to keep the flock from going astray. Guilt's part of that. I don't know, there's so much negativity in the world as it is. That's right, we're looking for a church that's supportive, a place where we can feel good about ourselves. I'm not sure the guilt thing works for us. On the other hand, you do offer racquetball. So did the Unitarians, honey. Let's shop around some more. Okay, so I don't actually advocate 12-step churches. I do think the church should be the church and 12-step should be 12-step, and they're both doing a good job. But I do want to have a bridge between the two, and not that kind of bridge. The Doonesbury Bridge wasn't the bridge I had in mind. AA has been amazingly successful in reaching persons that organized religion is often missed. And so I still say that AA is doing a fabulous job, and it should keep doing it, but it's not enough. It's not enough on the church's end, because we also need religion to pick up where AA leaves off. Because if AA, like I said before, is spiritual kindergarten, I think religion has to start providing the rest of the grades. I mean, all religions really should care about recovering people. So that kind of links back to my first talk, so why don't we should have some time for questions, do we? Let's go back and see if we have any questions. What time do we end this? What time does this end, 11:15? 11. Well, I'm sure we can take a couple of questions.
About a bridge between religion and AA, I'm just wondering if perhaps faith-based addictions, treatment centers could be a bridge.
They could, but I'm really concerned that they bring in what I consider dysfunctional views of sin, and that they reimpose that on people that actually need to think of religion as a more liberating alternative, as a way to deepen their spirituality, as opposed to something that just puts them back in a box that they probably were running away from. So it would have to be done with real exquisite grace and care, and real being attuned to therapeutic principles and all that, and you know, understanding both sides of the street really, really well. But if you can do it that way, then yeah, that would be great. I'd rather see the church be open to more people and not say, well, these are the scapegoats and these are the good people. You know, these sins are worse and these sins are not so bad, and let's you know, separate them out. I'd rather have somebody say, well, you know, greed and excess consumption is really bad, and you know, excess consumption of alcohol is kind of bad. Excess consumption at the shopping mall is kind of bad too. So maybe we have a lot in common here, you know. Or else maybe focus on grace and liberation as opposed to focusing on what's wrong with you, and that may be actually more healthy than any focusing on what's, you know, I mean, it does hold you back from God, but maybe if you focused on the goal as opposed to the block, we get further. I mean, that's in religion as an ideal state.
Kind of continuing on that same thing, do you think the populations that seek treatment through 12-step versus faith-based organizations for recovery are different somewhat, or have different needs?
The populations?
The individuals, that they're based on their beliefs on spirituality, you think that they have kind of distinct needs that maybe need unique programs?
Well, I can't make global statements about, you know, people, because people are so individual. Maybe somebody would be good in AA for a while and then find a faith-based group that work for them too. But I'm glad there's options. That's what's great about North America. We have options. We can church shop. We can, you know, group shop. So I don't know if I can't make global statements about different populations, but I'm glad that those groups exist, because some people do feel a little worried in a more generic spiritual approach that it won't really connect with their own religious experience, and that's important. You should respect that. I don't think people should be talked out of their religious experience. In fact, I really don't like when somebody says, I'm a recovering Catholic. I feel really offended by that. If you're a Roman Catholic and you've had problems in your church, well, we'll deal with that, but it's not a disease. You know, to be a Catholic, I don't think so. I was a Catholic, but I would never say I'm a recovering Catholic. I just happen to have a call to ministry, and they have a little block there with that, so I had to move on. Back there.
Could you explain your concern again? I have difficulty, or I guess I don't quite understand your concern with 12-step recovering people becoming clergy, and how that would dilute your idea of sin.
No, it doesn't. It's not that they're diluting my idea of anything. It's that they, I think that the Oxford group idea of sin was a very narrow, limited, and sometimes dysfunctional understanding of sin. And because it got broadened out and transmuted into, I think, into the 12-step understanding of addiction or alcoholism, when the students come back to a seminary, they pretty much translate that version of addiction into their new version of sin, and to me it's like an old version of sin that really never worked that well in the first place. It's very focused on, it's very individualistic. It doesn't look at social sin. It doesn't look at global problems. It doesn't look at evil. It's like the Oxford group. It bases everything on your personal problem, and it also sees pride and self-will and self-control, and I don't think those are necessarily bad things. Those are things that help people recover. So I don't see those as bad, and it's way too simplistic too. Anything that stands between you and God is like, that's really, really sharp, and I don't know, it's rather unsubtle, the whole thing. What my students do with it, But then that's my job, is to teach them, to broaden out their understandings. They're lovely people. I love them. They're great. I want them to go on and have a vocation. I just want to make sure they have a deeper understanding of what's wrong in the human condition and what could be right and how a human being looks when they're healthy.
From a treatment perspective, we run a treatment center and the one thing that I look at is religion is just another possible tool for people in recovery to kind of achieve a deeper recovery or a broader, not just sobriety or abstinence, but actual having a more rounded lifestyle,
Yeah, right.
healthier lifestyle. And one of the things that I've noticed is that when they go through our program, because we do step work, that those that had religion or they were that did have a very strong upbringing in church tend to go back to that after they go through treatment. And they actually become quite studious in their attempts to kind of recapture that experience that they had before treatment. And so I think that from my experiences, religion can be, as opposed not to say anything about spirituality, but religion itself does have a place in recovery. It really does. It may not have for everybody. The only thing I see is people that didn't have religion before they go into treatment. I just see that there's a lot of obstacles in their way to actually go into religion after treatment.
Right. Well, there's a lot of social and cultural obstacles, just protocols, and how do you sit here, and like how are you supposed to dress, and how do people act to you, and do they really care about me, and are these so there's just like getting used to the group. It's a different group and it looks different and it acts different. There's all that, and if you never had that, it seems weird. But I think with so many options around, you could probably find some religious group that work for you, and it could be non-traditional. It doesn't have to be traditional. I just think connectivity and community is the way to deepen your relationship with God. I don't think it's sitting all by yourself all the time meditating. I do think that's part of it, but having compassion for all people and living among all people, in peace is part of what it means to be religious and spiritual. And you can't do that by yourself. And you really can't just do that in AA because you're with like-minded people who have the same problem you do. You have to learn to live with other people with other problems without saying all the reality is in this room, in these rooms, and the rest of the people are addicted but they don't know it. I mean, that's a very judgmental position. So in some ways, AA has a little bit of a similarity to some of the problems that religion has too, and a lot of the good parts too. But I just think they need to go back into the wider world eventually, but not right. I mean, for some people it'll take a very long time and maybe won't ever happen. But I see ones who are pretty far on their recovery because I see them, they're going back to school and stuff.
I'd like to just hear your perception or understanding of personal sin. Just only because when you say, to say that the global crisis, how can you relate personal sin to that or social issues? My feeling is it's totally related to when I say personal sin or holding yourself accountable. It's that concept, ignorance is bliss. People, if they just are ignorant and they don't take responsibility for what's happening on the ills of society or what's happening globally, like global warming, each individual is totally responsible for that. And I think in some way you could use the word sin or whatever. It's a sin. It's not right, in other words, for people not to take responsibility for the global warming crisis, for example. So I kind of disagree with you there that how can you say that the tsunami has anything to do with, each person's personal sin? To me, it has everything to do with it.
Well, it interfaces, but...
even if it's the governments who are, somewhat, responsible for it, and then each person has the responsibility.
We do, yeah.
Politically can get rid of that.
That's a really good, I think, proactive, very responsible position. But unfortunately, humans have a little bit of megalomania. We really do think that we're the start and the cause and the end and the beginning of everything, and really we're not. And I don't mean that God is. I mean, there is actually There are actually forces that are bigger than us, and sometimes it's the accumulated forces of everybody's little contribution to a huge problem that becomes a huge problem and takes on a life of its own. I mean, the Bible actually talks about principalities and powers, and they had a very, demon and all that kind of cosmology, which I don't have. But sometimes things are so big that our actions aren't enough. And it's true, together we can improve things. But there's some things that are evil, and they really are unexplainable. I mean, it's what we call in theology absurd. I mean, there are some things that are so big and so bad that it doesn't link directly to my taking responsibility. I can't really fix it. That's why we need God. I mean, that's why individuals' personal sin is really a very limited perspective. And we do actually need bigger help than just us alone or all of us together. I think we're the hands and feet of the divine, but even then the divine is a lot bigger than us. And so there's a little bit of pride in that. I mean, I agree with you. I want to feel that way too. I do feel that way. But you need to sometimes relax and say, I'll do what I can, but I'm one finite individual who will make my best contribution, but I may not be able to fix it all, even linking.
I totally agree with that. The divine is huge, and it's only each person is like saying, yeah, I'm so small, and all this is going on, but it's the interrelationship.
Yeah, we need to link up with others.
The mutual,
Yeah.
interconnectedness of all of us.
Right.
Taking, just having an awareness and saying, hey, what can me as this little speck in this huge universe do? And I just think there are too many people who look the other way and
Right.
don't see that connection, and they say it's out there and it's not
Yeah, I know.
what I'm doing, and that's
Right.
just where I go.
Some of us take so much responsibility, and other people don't hardly take any. So I wish we could even it out better, because we'd fix a lot more things if some of us weren't as caring at all, and the rest, thinking we were anyway, and the rest we aren't really, but we think we are, and the rest of the people are like, well, I guess we can't do anything about it. It'd be nice if we spread that guilt out a little bit. I have a strong guilt tradition. I'm Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant. I have all those things. I have my 3 flavors of guilt. What? Yeah, that's right. They did that too. Okay, well, thank you very much.